Preface. Henry Kissinger opens on China by recalling that 40 years earlier, almost to the day, President Nixon had sent him to Beijing to reestablish contact with a country that had been sealed off from high-level American dealings for more than 20 years. The American motive was to offer a vision of peace transcending the Vietnam War and the Cold War. China, though technically a Soviet ally, was seeking room to resist a threatened Soviet attack. Kissinger notes that he has since visited China more than 50 times, and that his primary source for this book is his own record of conversations with 4 generations of Chinese leaders. Since that first journey, China has become an economic superpower, the United States has prevailed in the Cold War, and the relationship between the two has become central to the peace of the world. 8 American presidents and 4 generations of Chinese leaders, he observes, manage that relationship with astonishing consistency. The preface introduces the book's guiding distinction between 2 forms of exceptionalism. American exceptionalism, he argues, is missionary. It holds that the United States has an obligation to spread its values to every part of the world. China's exceptionalism is cultural. China does not proselytize. It does not claim that its institutions are relevant outside China. But it is the heir of the Middle Kingdom tradition, which formally graded all other states as various levels of tributaries based on their approximation to Chinese cultural and political forms. Understanding this difference, Kissinger suggests, is essential to understanding everything that follows. He explains his method and his sources. The book rests on declassified American papers, on the archives of the Cold War International History Project, and the Carter and Reagan presidential libraries, and above all on his own records of conversations with Chinese leaders from Mao Zedong to the present. He notes a matter of spelling that carries its own significance. The book uses the pinyin system of romanization, officially adopted in the People's Republic in 1979, so that the reader meets Deng Xiaoping rather than the older forms, though he retains a few familiar spellings such as Sun Tzu. The most striking fact, he suggests, is the sheer continuity of the relationship. Across 4 decades, through the deaths of leaders, the upheavals of the Cultural Revolution, the crisis of Tiananmen, and the end of the Cold War, 8 American presidents and 4 generations of Chinese leaders sustained a strategic dialogue whose fundamental logic scarcely changed. Prologue. The prologue argues that China is singular. No other country can claim so long a continuous civilization, or so intimate a link to its ancient past and to the classical principles of its strategy. To illustrate, Kissinger recounts a scene from October 1962. As Chinese and Indian forces confronted each other along the Himalayan frontier, Mao Zedong summoned his commanders and reached back into the very classical tradition he was otherwise dismantling. He told them that China and India had fought 1.5 wars over the previous 1,500 years, and that they should study those precedents for lessons in how to fight now. The first war, during the Tang dynasty, had been followed by centuries of flourishing exchange. The lesson was that China and India were not doomed to permanent enmity, but that China might have to deliver a sharp blow to bring India back to the negotiating table. The offensive unfolded as Mao described, a sudden, concentrated attack, followed by a withdrawal to the previous line, and even the return of captured equipment. In no other country, Kissinger writes, is it conceivable that a modern leader would launch a major national undertaking by invoking strategic principles from a millennium-old event. Yet China is singular. From its emergence as a unified state in the 3rd century before Christ until the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912, China stood at the center of an East Asian international system of remarkable durability, its emperor regarded as the pinnacle of a universal political hierarchy, its very name for itself, Zhongguo, meaning the Middle Kingdom or central country. Mao's history lesson, Kissinger notes, was more precise still. The half-war he described was the sack of Delhi by the Mongol conqueror Tamerlane, counted as only half because Mongolia and China were then a single political entity. And where Tamerlane's army had slaughtered its prisoners, Mao instructed his own forces to be restrained and principled, to strike hard, and then to stop. It is this fusion of ruthlessness and calculation, of ancient precedent and modern purpose, that Kissinger holds up as the mark of the Chinese strategic mind, and it is why he insists that the diplomacy of the People's Republic can be understood only against the long background of the imperial tradition. Chapter 1. The Singularity of China. The first chapter develops the portrait of China as a singular kind of empire, a civilization that claimed universal relevance without seeking converts, That was, for centuries, the wealthiest society on earth, yet largely indifferent to foreign trade and innovation, and that developed a strategic tradition, prizing patience, indirection, and psychological advantage over decisive clashes. China, Kissinger observes, seems to have no beginning. It appears in history less as a conventional nation-state than as a permanent natural phenomenon. Even its legendary founders are described as restorers rather than creators. The Yellow Emperor is said to have re-established, not founded, an empire. And Confucius claimed to have invented nothing, only to have reinvigorated the lost principles of harmony. A missionary once wrote that Chinese civilization originates in an antiquity so remote that we vainly endeavor to discover its commencement. Chinese written characters took form during the Shang dynasty in the second millennium before Christ, when Egypt was near its height, and the descendants of that script are read today by more than 1 billion people. Kissinger stresses the rhythm of unity and fracture. After each collapse, the Chinese state reconstituted itself, as if by some immutable law of nature. The 14th century epic, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which Mao pored over, begins with the maxim that, quote, "The empire, long divided, must unite. Long united, must divide. Thus it has ever been." He notes the sheer scale of China's preeminence. As late as 1820, China accounted for more than 30% of world economic output, more than Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the United States combined. During the Song dynasty, China led the world in nautical technology. In the early 15th century, the great fleets of the Admiral Deng, he reached Java, India, the Horn of Africa, and the Strait of Hormuz, generations before Europe's age of exploration, and dwarfing anything Europe could then send to sea. Yet these voyages sought no colonies, only tribute and ritual acknowledgement, and they stopped abruptly in 1433, a hinge, in Kissinger's phrase, that failed to swing. The chapter turns to Confucianism, adopted as state philosophy under the Han Dynasty, which became, Kissinger says, China's Bible and its constitution combined. Mastery of the classic texts qualified a man for the imperial bureaucracy through competitive examination. The goal of governance was rectification, not progress. Because China had never encountered a society it regarded as comparable, it offered other states impartiality, but not equality. Foreign envoys were expected to perform the kowtow, the ritual of 3 kneelings and 9 prostrations. When militarily weaker than its mobile neighbors, China practiced the management of, quote, barbarians, ruling with a loose rein and using barbarians to check barbarians, and absorbing its conquerors through the slow work of cultural assimilation. Finally, the chapter contrasts 2 games. Western strategy, Kissinger suggests, resembles chess, which aims at total victory in decisive battle. Chinese strategy resembles Wei Qi, the game of surrounding stones, which prizes protracted campaigns, relative advantage, and strategic encirclement. He introduces Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which merges the political and psychological with the military, teaching that the highest form of warfare is to attack the enemy's strategy itself, and that ultimate excellence lies not in winning every battle, but in defeating the enemy without ever fighting. The Chinese ideal, he writes, was combative coexistence with rivals, patience, and the accumulation of advantage over time. Kissinger draws out the concept the Chinese called shi, the strategic disposition or potential energy of an unfolding situation, for which he says there is no Western equivalent. The ideal strategist is like water flowing downhill, exploiting the configuration of the ground rather than forcing a decisive collision. He illustrates China's serene self-regard with an arresting detail. As late as 1863, after China had already lost 2 wars to the West, its emperor could write to Abraham Lincoln, invoking his commission from heaven to rule the universe. He quotes the political scientist Lucian Pai's famous observation that China is not merely another nation-state, but a civilization pretending to be a nation-state, and notes that China's share of world output was, in 18 of the last 20 centuries, greater than that of any Western society. This was a country, in short, that had never before met a counterpart it regarded as an equal, and whose entire conception of order was hierarchical, cultural, and centered upon itself. Understanding how such a civilization would respond when it finally encountered powers that neither acknowledged its centrality nor wished to join it is, Kissinger argues, the drama of the chapters to come. He notes that China's rulers governed by moral prestige as much as by force, translating raw power into a claim of obligation. The emperor was at once the son of heaven and the emperor of humanity, and a dynasty that governed badly could forfeit the mandate of heaven. Yet the same civilization that seemed serenely superior was in practice often militarily weaker than the mobile peoples on its frontiers, and so it perfected the arts of the weak made strong, playing one tribe against another, buying time, and trusting to the slow solvent of its culture to absorb whatever conqueror force could not repel. It is this combination, cultural confidence married to strategic patience, that Kissinger presents as the enduring inheritance the modern Chinese state would draw upon. Chapter 2. The Kowtow Question and the Opium War. The second chapter describes the 19th century collision between the Chinese world order and the industrial powers of the West. For the first time, China faced outsiders who did not seek to claim the mandate of heaven, but to replace the entire Sino-centric system with their own conception of sovereign equality, free trade, and resident embassies. The clash, Kissinger argues, was fundamentally between two incompatible visions of world order, and it left wounds still festering more than a century later. He begins with the Canton system, under which European trade was confined to a single port and hedged with restrictions. Teaching a foreigner Chinese was unlawful. The turning point he examines is the Macartney Mission of 1793, which he calls the most notable and least militaristic British attempt to open China, and which failed completely. Lord Macartney brought gifts designed to display British industrial prowess, but Chinese officials treated the mission as a tribute embassy, and the Emperor Qianlong responded to King George III with an edict of serene dismissal. "We possess all things," he wrote, "and strange and costly objects do not interest me." Macartney privately concluded that a couple of English frigates could overmatch the entire Chinese navy, though Kissinger reminds the reader that China's economy was then still roughly 7 times the size of Britain's. The confrontation came to a head over opium, grown in British India and smuggled into China. In 1839, Beijing dispatched the official Lin Zexu, who confiscated the opium and blockaded the foreign factories. Britain responded with a fleet, and its steam vessels and modern artillery overwhelmed China's defenses. The chapter follows the Chinese effort to manage the disaster through the traditional method of soothing the barbarians, the strategy pursued by officials such as Qing, who cultivated a personal bond with the British envoy. The result was the Treaty of Nanjing and the treaties that followed, the first of what the Chinese would call the unequal treaties. Their terms included an indemnity, the cession of Hong Kong, the opening of 5 treaty ports, extraterritoriality for foreigners, and, most galling of all, dealings on a footing of perfect equality. The deeper meaning, Kissinger argues, is that China's traditional method of absorbing conquerors failed, because the Europeans had no wish to become Chinese. They lived thousands of miles away and sought commerce, not membership. Within a single decade, China moved from preeminence to becoming an object of contending colonial powers. Kissinger lingers on the symbolism of the kowtow, over which Macartney's mission nearly foundered. The envoy was eventually permitted to bend one knee rather than prostrate himself, though the official Chinese account claimed he had performed the full ritual regardless. Later British attempts fared no better. Lord Amherst's embassy of 1816 collapsed into a protocol brawl, and Lord Napier, sent in 1834, was mocked by the local name, laboriously vile, and died of fever, though not before noting the potential of Hong Kong's harbor. Kissinger reproduces the poignant letter that Commissioner Lin Zexu addressed to Queen Victoria, appealing to her conscience over the opium trade, a letter that appears never to have reached her. He notes the observation of the translator Thomas Meadows that most Chinese perceive the war not as a national catastrophe, but as merely a rebellious eruption of a tribe of barbarians. The tragedy in Kissinger's telling is that China's rulers still did not grasp that these particular barbarians could not be assimilated, that their demands were limited only by their resources and their appetite, and that the elaborate machinery of tributary diplomacy had encountered a force it was not designed to absorb. Chapter 3. From Preeminence to Decline. The third chapter traces China's century of humiliation, from the mid-19th century to the founding of the People's Republic. Kissinger's central argument is that China faced 3 simultaneous challenges, from the West, from Russia, and from Japan, together with vast internal rebellion, and that it nonetheless preserved its territorial and moral cohesion, using almost entirely traditional methods, the analytical skill of its diplomats, and the endurance of its people. The 3 challenges differed in kind. The West threatened not by seizing the throne, but by imposing an incompatible order of trade, missionaries, and embassies. Russia pressed from the north and west, annexing vast hinterlands and, unlike China's earlier conquerors, never becoming Sinicized. Japan, uniquely, sought to supplant Beijing as the center of a new East Asian order. China's response, Kissinger writes, was to reject wholesale westernization, to insist on scrupulous adherence to the unequal treaties precisely in order to cap foreign demands, and to play its adversaries against one another. The scholar Wei Yuan set out the blueprint after the Opium War, to use barbarians against barbarians and to learn their superior techniques in order to control them. China's difficulty, Kissinger notes, was that it had not the slightest idea how to implement such a policy, possessing no embassies abroad and little knowledge of the outside world. Meanwhile, the empire was convulsed by internal upheaval. The Taiping Rebellion, led by a mystic who believed himself the younger brother of Jesus, together with the Nian and Muslim rebellions, contributed to a staggering demographic catastrophe. China's population fell from roughly 410 million in 1850 to some 350 million 2 decades later, with casualties in the tens of millions. Foreign pressure continued. A second war brought the burning of the Summer Palace by Lord Elgin, still resented in China a century and a half later, and Russia seized outer Manchuria, including the site of Vladivostok, some 350,000 square miles. Kissinger profiles the officials who managed this decline, above all Li Hongzhang, who served nearly 4 decades as China's face to the world and championed, quote, self-strengthening, the acquisition of firearms, steamships, and foreign language schools. Li asked whether Chinese wisdom was truly inferior to that of Westerners, and concluded that what China lacked was not intelligence but a material basis of power. He was opposed by traditionalists, who quoted Mencius to the effect that he had never heard of anyone being changed by the barbarians. The chapter follows the disaster of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, in which Japan destroyed a Chinese fleet whose modernization funds had been diverted to rebuild the Summer Palace, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which cost China Taiwan and its influence in Korea. Li's mournful summary near the end of his life was a question: who would be so foolish as to cast missiles at a rat in the vicinity of a priceless piece of porcelain? The Boxer Uprising and an 8-power intervention followed. The Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, and China fragmented among warlords, entering what amounted to its own warring states period. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921, Japan created the puppet state of Manchukuo and invaded in 1937, and after the Second World War and a renewed civil war, the nationalists retreated to Taiwan and Mao proclaimed the People's Republic in 1949. Mao inherited the ancient challenge: open frontiers, more than a dozen neighbors, and a newly confident American superpower. Kissinger gives particular weight to a document he calls a model of strategic clarity, the 1861 memorial of Prince Gong, the emperor's half-brother and the effective head of government after the burning of the Summer Palace. Prince Gong ranked China's threats with cold precision. The internal rebellions were an organic disease striking at the heart. Russia, nibbling away China's territory like a silkworm, was a threat at the bosom. Britain, seeking only trade, was merely an affliction of the limbs. His counsel echoed the classics: resort to peace and friendship when temporarily obliged, but use war and defense as the real policy. From this analysis came the Zhongli Yamen, the office for managing the affairs of all nations, created as a temporary expedient, and so grudgingly regarded that it was not formally listed among the offices of state for decades. Kissinger also underscores how Russia profited from China's weakness, its envoy Ignatieff playing mediator and threat at once, and how, after the Sino-Japanese War, a Russia-led intervention forced Japan to disgorge the Liaodong Peninsula, only for Russia to seize the same ground itself. Through it all, he argues, China's diplomats performed with great skill the essentially defensive task of playing the powers against one another, preserving the shell of the empire even as its substance drained away, until the dynasty finally fell in 1912, and China dissolved into its own age of warring states. Chapter 4: Mao's Continuous Revolution. The 4th chapter portrays Mao Zedong as a figure of vast contradiction. He was the first ruler since unification who set out to overthrow the entire value system of Chinese society, waging what he called continuous revolution at home. Yet in foreign policy he drew, sometimes deliberately, and sometimes unconsciously, on the oldest strategic traditions of China. He was, Kissinger writes, anti-Confucian, yet steeped in the classics, a revolutionary who nonetheless aimed at a version of the ancient ideal of great harmony. Where earlier dynasties had legitimized themselves by affirming ancient values, Mao proposed to destroy them. He most admired Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, who had unified China in the 3rd century before Christ and was reputed to have burned books and buried scholars alive. Mao declared that governance required a combination of Marx's methods and those of Qin Shi Huang. To the writer André Malraux, he said that the thought, culture, and customs that had brought China to its present state must disappear, and that the new must appear. Yet Kissinger describes Maoist rule as the Confucian tradition seen through the looking glass, retaining the state as an ethical project and recreating the very Mandarin bureaucracy Mao professed to loathe. Mao's operative principle was that disequilibrium is normal and absolute, whereas equilibrium is temporary and relative. This created a permanent dilemma. How can a state in perpetual upheaval take part in the international system? Mao substituted ideological militancy and psychological perception for physical strength. Kissinger finds the key image in the empty city stratagem from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, in which a commander, having no troops, throws open his city gates and calmly plays a lute, so unnerving the enemy that it retreats, convinced of a hidden ambush. Mao's professed indifference to nuclear devastation, his willingness to speak of accepting hundreds of millions of casualties, drew on this tradition of turning weakness into psychological leverage, though Kissinger notes that the city was not entirely empty, since China eventually built its own arsenal. Mao, he argues, owed more to Sun Tzu than to Lenin. He referred far more often to the classic histories, to Sun Tzu, and to the great Chinese novels than to Marx. Kissinger is careful to distinguish rhetoric from action. World revolution was largely a slogan. China supported revolutionary movements, Mao told the journalist Edgar Snow, but not by invading countries. At home, however, continuous revolution was pursued in earnest, through the 100 Flowers campaign, the catastrophic Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution, in which, as Kissinger writes, millions died. The source of Mao's confidence, above ideology and tradition, was his faith in the resilience of the Chinese people. The chapter closes on the eternal Chinese rhythm reasserting itself. Mao restored China's frontiers to nearly their maximum historic extent, and left it a Cold War free agent on the winning side. Yet in 2011, a statue of Confucius was placed in Tiananmen Square, within sight of Mao's mausoleum, the only other figure so honored. Kissinger illustrates Mao's psychological warfare with the example of American misreading. When Marshal Lin Biao published a pamphlet in 1965 titled "Long Live the Victory of People's War," the Johnson administration read it as a blueprint for global subversion and cited it as a reason to send forces to Vietnam. In fact, Kissinger argues, the pamphlet was a statement of limits, insisting that revolution in any country is the business of the masses of that country and cannot be exported. He shows Mao conceiving of the threats from the United States and the Soviet Union in the terms of Wei Qi as stones being placed to encircle China and thinking always of how to break the encirclement. Mao's favorite fable was that of the foolish old man who set out to remove the mountains blocking his path, confident that his sons and grandsons would carry on the work until the mountains, reinterpreted by Mao as imperialism and feudalism, were gone. When Nixon complimented him on having transformed an ancient civilization, Mao demurred. "I have not been able to change it," he said. "I have only been able to change a few places in the vicinity of Beijing." Kissinger's verdict is that Mao's achievement was an astonishing tour de force, in which an impoverished country that repeatedly convulsed itself nonetheless fought the United States and India, defied the Soviet Union, and restored China's frontiers to nearly their greatest historic extent, ending the Cold War as a free agent on the winning side. Chapter 5: Triangular Diplomacy and the Korean War. The fifth chapter examines how Mao's hoped-for alliance with the Soviet Union instead opened an era of triangular diplomacy, in which the United States, China, and the Soviet Union maneuvered with and against one another, and how the Korean War drew a barely founded China into direct combat with the nuclear-armed United States. In December 1949, 2 months after proclaiming the People's Republic, Mao made his first foreign trip to Moscow, seeking a formal alliance. He told Stalin that China needed a period of 3 to 5 years of peace. Within less than a year, the two would be at war. Kissinger portrays Stalin as cynical and reluctant, fearful that Mao might become a second Tito and break with Moscow. Stalin argued that a new treaty was superfluous, in order not to give America and England legal grounds to revisit the concessions won at Yalta. Mao, the fervent nationalist, held out, and after a month, Stalin yielded. The resulting Treaty of Friendship, signed in February 1950, gave Mao his mutual assistance obligation, but at a steep price in Manchurian and Xinjiang concessions and the recognition of Outer Mongolia's independence. Mao later complained that Stalin had tried to build semi-colonies in China. The chapter then reconstructs the origins of the Korean War from the mutual suspicions of the two communist giants and the manipulations of a minor player, Kim Il-sung. Kissinger notes the revealing signals from Washington. Secretary of State Dean Acheson's National Press Club speech in January 1950 appeared to place Korea and Taiwan outside the American defensive perimeter, and internal papers floated the idea that the Soviet Union was detaching China's northern provinces. Stalin, initially cautious, reversed himself and encouraged Kim, while shifting the risk onto China. If you should get kicked in the teeth, he told Kim, I shall not lift a finger. You have to ask Mao for all the help. When North Korea attacked in June 1950, the United States not only intervened under a United Nations resolution made possible by a Soviet boycott of the Security Council, but also ordered the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, linking the war to the unfinished Chinese Civil War. Mao denounced this as an invasion of Asia. Kissinger emphasizes the distinctively Chinese logic of preemption. Long before American forces crossed the 38th parallel, China had massed hundreds of thousands of troops on the border and warned, through the Indian ambassador, that it would intervene. Acheson discounted the warning. When Stalin pressed and then confined his promised support to Chinese territory rather than Korea, Mao nonetheless ordered his armies across the Yalu in October 1950. The war settled into stalemate and an armistice in July 1953, roughly along the original dividing line. Kissinger's assessment is that the outcome was, in effect, a draw that a weak China turned into a strategic and psychological victory, proving that new China would fight the strongest power on earth to a standstill. The deeper irony, he writes, is that the biggest loser in the Korean War was Stalin. For Sino-Soviet relations began their long deterioration, and within a decade the Soviet Union would become China's principal adversary. Kissinger draws a careful distinction between two conceptions of deterrence. The Western idea measures success by wars avoided and rests on assembling overwhelming force. Mao's was offensive and psychological, a readiness to deliver a sudden blow followed swiftly by a political phase, precisely in order to shatter an adversary's calculations. He notes the scholarly puzzle of two contradictory versions of Mao's crucial telegram of October 1950, one affirmative and one equivocal, preserved in the Beijing and Moscow archives, and the explanation offered by the historian Shen Jiwa that a divided leadership had substituted the more cautious text. He recounts how two commanders declined the Korean command before Peng Dehuai accepted it, and how China's planners believed they could prevail because the United States would be capped at a few 100,000 troops against a Chinese army of 4 million, and because the intermingling of forces made nuclear use impractical. The larger purpose in Kissinger's reading was the forging of new China in fire, to purge what the leadership regarded as a historic softness, to assert China's arrival as a military power, and to claim leadership of the Asian Revolution, all of which the stalemate remarkably achieved. He is careful, too, about the human dimension of Stalin's calculation. By shifting the burden of the war onto China while withholding all but limited air support confined to Chinese airspace, Stalin ensured that whatever the outcome, the two communist powers would emerge more dependent on Moscow and more estranged from each other. Mao understood this and resented it, and the memory of having been made to bleed for Soviet purposes would color his dealings with Moscow for the rest of his life. Korea thus did double work in Kissinger's account. It announced China to the world as a power that would fight, and it planted the seed of the alliance's eventual collapse. Chapter 6. China confronts both superpowers. The sixth chapter describes Mao's audacious decision, rather than seek safety by aligning with one superpower, to challenge both the United States and the Soviet Union simultaneously. Kissinger calls this a brilliant application of the empty city stratagem, turning China's material weakness into psychological leverage while the Sino-Soviet alliance disintegrated. He argues that American policy misread the communist world as a monolith, applying European templates to an Asia still forming and beset by insurrection rather than cross-border attack. The first testing ground was the Taiwan Strait. In 1954, and again in 1958, Mao ordered the shelling of the offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu, provoking crises in which the United States considered the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Secretary Dulles spoke of them, and President Eisenhower said they might be used just exactly as you would use a bullet. Mao told a visiting ambassador that a China of 600 million people would survive atomic war, and that millet plus rifles would prevail. Yet, Kissinger shows that Mao's aims were subtle. He did not seek to occupy the islands, but to keep Chiang Kai-shek's forces within reach, and to preserve the link between the mainland and Taiwan. Khrushchev was baffled. "If you shoot," he said, "then you ought to capture these islands, and I do not understand this policy of yours." The heart of the chapter is the Sino-Soviet split. Kissinger locates its roots in deep cultural divergence. Russia had never claimed universal inspiration, while China could not accept the role of junior partner. Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin in 1956 dismayed Beijing, which branded de-Stalinization revisionism. Personal frictions accumulated, from Khrushchev's proposals for a joint fleet and radio station, which Mao took as an affront to sovereignty, to the swimming pool reception at which Mao, a strong swimmer, left the Soviet leader floundering in water wings. In the Second Taiwan Crisis, Mao explained that Americans started a fire in the Middle East, and we started another in the Far East. But his primary target was in fact Moscow, to force Khrushchev to choose between peaceful coexistence and the alliance. The consequences rebounded on Mao. Relations with the United States froze into a decade of deadlock, and the alarmed Soviets withdrew their promise to help China build an atomic bomb, and in 1960, recalled all their technicians and canceled their aid. Kissinger fills in the texture of the estrangement. The ambassadorial contacts between Washington and Beijing that grew out of the 1954 Geneva Conference dragged on for 136 meetings between 1955 and 1971, mostly in Warsaw, and produced only a single substantive agreement. The American demand that China renounce the use of force was an unprecedented precondition that no Chinese government could accept. He describes the almost farcical difficulty the Chinese delegation faced in learning the contents of Khrushchev's secret speech, from which they had been excluded, reconstructing it in part from reports in the New York Times. After the launch of Sputnik, Mao declared at a Moscow conference that the east wind prevails over the west wind, and delivered his standard speech on China's imperviousness to nuclear war, prompting the Czechoslovak leader Novotny to protest that his own small country would have no one left to start over. Kissinger presents the whole sequence as the tragic working out of an incompatibility of self-images, a Soviet Union that expected deference, and a China that could not conceive of itself as anyone's junior partner. The immediate result was that China now faced both superpowers as adversaries, which was, paradoxically, exactly the isolated and dangerous position from which Mao's later opening to America would spring. Chapter 7. A Decade of Crises. The seventh chapter covers the second decade of the People's Republic, dominated by Mao's conviction that moral and ideological vigor could overcome physical limits, a conviction that produced two domestic catastrophes framed by war on the Himalayan frontier, and that left China, by the late 1960s, isolated with declared adversaries on nearly every border. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, sought to vault China into full communism through people's communes and backyard steel furnaces. Cadres falsified output, grain continued to be exported, and useful tools were melted as scrap. The result was one of the worst famines in human history, with more than 20 million deaths. Kissinger's summary is stark. Mao had again called on the Chinese people to move mountains, but this time the mountains had not moved. The chapter then reconstructs the 1962 border war with India in detail, since it exemplifies the Chinese strategic style. The dispute concerned the eastern sector along the McMahon Line and the western plateau of Aksai Chin, across which China had built a road. When India advanced outposts in what it called its forward policy, Mao defined China's stance as armed coexistence. You wave a gun, and I'll wave a gun. He prepared the ground with characteristic thoroughness, probing American intentions through the Warsaw talks and securing the neutralization of Laos, then struck. Since Nehru sticks his head out and insists on us fighting him, he said, for us not to fight with him would not be friendly enough. Courtesy emphasizes reciprocity. The offensive came in two stages, reached the foothills, and then withdrew to its starting line, leaving the territorial question unresolved, but the psychological point made. Finally, the chapter turns to the Cultural Revolution, launched to smash the remnants of traditional culture. Red Guards, waving the Little Red Book compiled by Lin Biao, attacked the Four Olds. In Beijing, they destroyed nearly 5,000 of the capital's designated sites of historical interest, and the Forbidden City itself was saved only by Zhou Enlai's intervention. China recalled all but one of its ambassadors and retained warm relations with almost no country but Albania. Kissinger considers whether an opportunity for earlier reconciliation with the United States was lost, and concludes that the fundamental obstacle was Mao's own continuous revolution, which swung the country toward greater hostility precisely when accommodation might have been possible. By the end of the decade, even Mao recognized that China faced potential enemies on all its frontiers. The chapter dwells on the Tibetan question as background to the war with India. Chinese suzerainty over Tibet reached back to the Mongol and Qing periods, and Nehru had accepted Chinese sovereignty with autonomy until the Dalai Lama's flight to India in 1959 poisoned relations. Mao, Kissinger notes, had earlier ordered a withdrawal of 20 kilometers that Indian planners misread as timidity, prompting his tart remark that a person sleeping in a comfortable bed is not easily roused by someone else's snoring. He also weighs the missed diplomatic openings with Washington. The young Senator John Kennedy had warned in 1957 against a brittle conception of a shiftless totalitarian China, yet Mao's dialectic swung toward greater militancy, an American famine relief offer foundered because Mao's doctrine of self-reliance forbade China to ask, and President Johnson's outreach in 1966 coincided precisely with the eruption of the Cultural Revolution. Kissinger's melancholy conclusion is that the tragedy of the decade was self-inflicted. The very ideological fervor that devastated China at home also sealed it off from the outside world, until Mao himself, surveying enemies on every border, was driven to reconsider. Chapter 8. The Road to Reconciliation. The 8th chapter narrates the extraordinary convergence by which, within a single year, China and the United States moved from 2 decades of enmity toward a presidential emissary bound for Beijing. Kissinger presents 2 leaders acting from convergent necessity, Mao returning to the classical stratagem of negotiating with faraway countries while fighting with those that are near, and Nixon seeking, in Wilsonian terms, to bring China back into the community of nations. As Nixon had written before taking office, the world could not be safe. To leave China forever outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbors. The decisive external shock was the Soviet threat. In 1969, armed clashes erupted along the Ussuri River, and Soviet officials sounded out other governments about a possible strike on China's nuclear installations. Kissinger recounts that the American response, directed by Nixon, was to signal that the United States would not be indifferent if China were smashed, and to tilt discreetly toward Beijing, an unprecedented posture toward a communist power the United States did not recognize. Mao, for his part, recalled 4 purged marshals to study the strategic situation. They concluded, invoking the 3 kingdoms, that China should ally with Wu in the east to oppose Wei in the north, and one of them, Chen Yi, floated the then radical idea of dropping the precondition that Taiwan be settled first. The chapter delights in the intricate minuet of signaling that followed. Gestures through Edgar Snow, whom Mao placed beside him on the Tiananmen reviewing stand, approaches through Pakistan, Romania, and France, and the near-comic episode in Warsaw, in which American diplomats chased fleeing Chinese counterparts through a fashion show to deliver Nixon's message. Progress was repeatedly interrupted by the American incursion into Cambodia and by the reflexive caution of both bureaucracies, until the breakthrough of ping-pong diplomacy in April 1971, when Mao, on the edge of sleep after taking sleeping pills, suddenly ordered that the American table tennis team be invited to China, adding, quote, "Act promptly or it will be too late." A handwritten message from Zhou Enlai came, in Kissinger's phrase, for the first time, from ahead, through ahead, to ahead. Chinese leaders, he observes, operated on the concept of shi, the art of understanding matters in flux, and sought not a static legal settlement, but combative coexistence and a rebalancing of the global equilibrium. Kissinger reconstructs the study the 4 marshals conducted at Mao's behest. Their first conclusion was that the deepest antagonism lay between the two superpowers themselves, and that the United States would prefer to sit on the mountain and watch two tigers fight. By September, they had revised this, judging that America could not remain a spectator to a Sino-Soviet war. Chen Yi cited Stalin's pact with Hitler as a precedent for setting ideology aside, and added his wild ideas that China should raise the level of the Warsaw talks and drop the Taiwan precondition, since the Taiwan question could be settled gradually. He recounts the tense 3-hour meeting between Zhou Enlai and the Soviet Premier Kosygin at Beijing airport in 1969, and the wary signaling that followed. He recalls the cryptic message Mao sent through Edgar Snow, describing himself as a lone monk walking the world with a leaky umbrella, and the message from Zhou that arrived, in Kissinger's phrase, for the first time from ahead, through ahead to ahead. The intermediaries were themselves chosen with care: Pakistan, Romania, and France, each a state on good terms with both sides, so that a message could travel without either party losing face. What made the breakthrough possible, he insists, was not a resolution of the concrete disputes, which remained, but a shared reading of the strategic situation. Kissinger also stresses how nearly the whole enterprise came undone through mutual wariness. Each government feared that a premature disclosure would expose it to domestic attack, and each tested the other through a succession of indirect signals, whose meaning had to be painstakingly decoded. A stray remark by a State Department spokesman, an offhand dismissal of an invitation as casually made, could set the effort back for weeks. That two systems so opposed, and two bureaucracies so cautious, could nonetheless converge within a single year, he attributes to the clarity with which both Mao and Nixon grasped the essential point, that the Soviet Union had become the paramount danger to each, and that their estrangement from one another had become a luxury neither could any longer afford. Chapter 9. Resumption of Relations. First Encounters with Mao and Joe. The 9th chapter recounts the secret reopening of Sino-American relations, and it is the emotional center of the book, for here Kissinger describes his own first journeys to Beijing and his encounters with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong. He argues that the negotiation succeeded because it was conducted less as bargaining over concrete disputes than as an alignment of worldviews, crystallized in the deliberately unconventional Shanghai Communique. Secrecy, he insists, was strategically essential. A public mission would have triggered clearance battles and demands for consultation, including from Taiwan, and mortgaged the prospects with Beijing. He recalls the cover story of a stomach ailment during a trip to Pakistan, the 48 hours in Beijing in July 1971, and the Chinese use of hospitality and ceremony as instruments of statecraft. In some 60 years of public life, he writes, I have encountered no more compelling figure than Zhou Enlai. He contrasts the two leaders memorably. Mao dominated any gathering, Zhou suffused it. Mao's passion strove to overwhelm opposition. Zhou's intellect would seek to persuade or outmaneuver it. Zhou cut the Gordian knot of Taiwan by no longer insisting it be resolved first, and expressed on Vietnam only a debt owed by China's ancestors. Kissinger dwells on the Chinese conception of friendship as hard-headed rather than sentimental. To be admitted as an old friend made confrontation harder, and was itself a form of the traditional management of outsiders. When Nixon arrived in February 1972, Mao, already gravely ill, summoned him within hours to a study cluttered with books, and conducted a conversation that was elliptical and Socratic, deflecting philosophy and strategy to Zhou, while conveying the essentials. Taiwan need not be an obstacle. China's forces do not go abroad, and ideology had become, in his phrase, so much big cannons. The long dialogues with Zhou, Kissinger writes, rested on a candid appeal to national interest. Nixon told him that friendship could not be the basis of a durable relationship, but that mutual interest and reliability could. Kissinger recalls the atmosphere of the Mao meeting with almost novelistic care. The study lined with books and manuscripts, the frail chairman helped to his feet by attendants, the conversation ranging by indirection over history and philosophy, while carefully skirting the concrete questions Mao preferred to leave to Zhou. Mao made a point of dismissing the ideological quarrel as so many empty gestures, remarking that he had, in effect, voted for the American right, and that he preferred to deal with those who said plainly what they wanted. Nixon, for his part, told his own ambassador that the United States was turning to China not out of affection, but because its interests required it. The two nations were, in his phrase, simply there, and reality demanded that they deal with one another. From this hard-headed premise, Kissinger argues, grew a durability that sentiment alone could never have supplied. The chapter closes on the Shanghai Communiqué itself. Mao intervened to reject a bland conventional draft, insisting that each side state its own position and leave the disagreements visible. Kissinger, taken aback at first, came to see that this format allowed each government to reassure its own domestic audience, while highlighting the crucial convergence, the pledge that neither should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. On Taiwan, the carefully chosen language was that the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, a formulation whose ambiguity would prove durable. The visit, he concludes, was one of the few occasions on which a state visit itself brought about a seminal change in international affairs, producing not perpetual friendship, but a rebalancing of the world's equilibrium. Kissinger conveys the delicacy of that first encounter through its ceremony. The protocol gap was vast, since he ranked merely as a deputy to the president while Joe was premier of a great state. And it was Joe who came to call on the Americans, a courtesy Kissinger did not miss. The handshake itself carried weight, erasing the memory of the moment at Geneva in 1954 when Secretary Dulles had refused to shake Joe's hand. He explores the Chinese notion that to be received as an old friend is not sentimentality, but a form of obligation, a way of binding a counterpart and making confrontation harder, an aspect of the ancient management of outsiders. He describes Mao's account of the Lin Biao affair, the designated successor who had died that year when his plane crashed in Mongolia after an alleged plot offered as evidence that China's own house had been in disorder. And he explains why the single word acknowledges in the Taiwan paragraph mattered so much, for it allowed the United States to note the Chinese position without formally endorsing it, leaving room for the relationship to evolve. The Chinese, for their part, summarized the whole enterprise to their own cadres in the language of statecraft, as utilizing contradictions, dividing up the enemies, and enhancing themselves. Chapter 10. The Quasi-Alliance, Conversations with Mao. The 10th chapter defines the peculiar character of the relationship that followed, not a formal alliance, nor even a tacit one, but what Kissinger calls a quasi-alliance, coordinated action without binding reciprocal obligation, rooted in Mao's insistence on self-reliance and a shared perception of the Soviet threat. He frames the chapter around two late conversations with Mao in February and November of 1973. Mao, who had once told Kissinger the two countries were enemies, now said, "Now we call the relationship between ourselves a friendship." Mao proposed a militant global containment he called the horizontal line, a strategy of confronting Soviet power across a broad arc from the United States through Japan, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and Europe. He urged the United States to be stronger, not weaker, in the Middle East and the Indian Ocean, prompting Kissinger's observation that Mao was the quintessential Cold Warrior, of whom American conservatives would have approved. Coordination, Mao stressed, arose not from obligation, but from parallel self-interest. Each side acted out of its own necessity, and so we can work together to commonly deal with a bastard. Kissinger explores the contradictions in this arrangement. It clashed with China's insistence on self-reliance. Collective security tends to reduce itself to the least common denominator, and China feared its partners might instead conciliate Moscow and push, in Joe's phrase, the ill waters of the Soviet Union eastward. Mao remained impervious to nuclear intimidation, joking that if the Soviets killed all Chinese over the age of 30, it would at least solve the problem of teaching everyone Mandarin, and dismissing offers of an American nuclear umbrella as no more use than the cat weeping over the dead mouse. He even voiced a suspicion that the United States secretly hoped to let the Soviets become bogged down in China and then strike at their back, a theoretically feasible strategy, Kissinger concedes, that lacked only a leader to conceive it or a public to support it. The chapter ends on the corrosive effect of Watergate, which was incomprehensible in Beijing, and on the growing Chinese fear that the United States, weakened at home and pursuing détente with Moscow, had become guilty of something worse than treachery, ineffectualness. Kissinger records how the collapse of Nixon's authority and the subsequent constraints on American power, the investigations of the intelligence services, the War Powers Act, the congressional refusal to sustain commitments in Indochina, appeared to Chinese eyes as a failure of will precisely when Mao was urging the United States to stand firmer against Moscow. To a leadership that measured strength by the readiness to run risks, an America that spoke of détente while retreating looked less like a partner than a liability. The quasi-alliance, he concludes, was always vulnerable to this asymmetry of expectation. China wanted an uncompromising confrontation with the Soviet Union, while the United States, for reasons of its own domestic politics and its global responsibilities, kept open the option of accommodation, so that each side periodically suspected the other of maneuvering to leave it exposed. Kissinger sets the two conversations in their moments. The first, in February 1973, came just after the Paris Accords that ended American involvement in Vietnam, which freed China from any need to demonstrate solidarity with Hanoi. The second, in November, followed the decisive American role in the Arab-Israeli War and Egypt's turn from Moscow toward Washington. Mao told a story about a long-ago exchange with the Soviets, in which he had vowed to wage struggle for 10,000 years, then magnanimously conceded to cut it down by 1,000 years, his way of dramatizing that principles could bend to circumstance. Kissinger notes a striking reversal on Japan, where Zhou had warned in 1971 that Japan's feathers had grown and it was about to take flight. Mao, by 1973, was urging the Americans to cultivate Tokyo, lest it drift to the Soviet side. The deepest irony Kissinger records is that Mao's opening did not produce the effect Mao had expected. He had assumed it would multiply Soviet anxiety. Instead, Moscow began competing for Washington's favor, and superpower contacts multiplied, cutting against the old revolutionary's instincts and feeding his suspicion that the détente he watched was a kind of shadowboxing at China's expense. Chapter 11. The End of the Mao Era. The 11th chapter describes Mao's final years, in which, torn between Sino-centric pragmatism and revolutionary fervor, he refused to resolve the succession and instead institutionalized his own ambivalence, setting a pragmatist camp around Zhou and later Deng against the radical ideologues later known as the Gang of Four, with Hua Guofeng in between. Mao, Kissinger writes, fostered each camp and then set them against each other. The Gang of Four, led by his wife Jiang Qing, a former actress, advocated turning inward and purifying culture of foreign and bourgeois influence, yet lacked any military or long march credentials. The administrators, Zhou and Deng, stood for order, professionalism, and moderation, though neither believed in Western democracy. The chapter follows the fall of Zhou Enlai, whose position as the second man in an autocracy was inherently perilous. Found to have cancer, subjected to political criticism, he was gradually removed from policymaking. At a banquet, Kissinger once remarked that China remained essentially Confucian, and Zhou, for the only time Kissinger saw, lost his temper, insisting that Confucianism was a doctrine of class oppression, while communism was a philosophy of liberation. A performance staged partly for the record. Kissinger recounts his last meetings with a dying Mao, whose speech had to be transcribed from wheezes by his interpreters, but whose mind remained sharp. Mao insisted the relationship still had substance. The small issue is Taiwan, the big issue is the world, and reaffirmed that on Taiwan he could wait 100 years, telling Kissinger it was better for the island to remain, for now, in American hands. He complained that China had slipped in American priorities, that it had become the fifth, the little finger, and that the United States was leaping to Moscow by way of our shoulders. Asked how China would survive an all-out attack, he answered with a single word, Dunkirk, meaning that China would let the enemy occupy its cities and still prevail through the endurance of its people. Zhou Enlai died in January 1976. The public mourning at the Monument to the People's Heroes was suppressed, and Deng was purged a second time. Mao himself died in September 1976. Kissinger's epitaph is balanced. Mao left China unified as it had not been for centuries, and cleared the underbrush for reforms he never intended, but at horrendous cost, comparable to that exacted by the first emperor Qin Shi Huang. Kissinger sketches the contending factions more fully. The Gang of Four, Jiang Qing, the former actress, the theorist Zhang Chunqiao, the literary critic Yao Wenyuan, and the young Wang Hongwen, once a security guard, had no roots in the Long March and depended entirely on Mao's favor. Their programs of radical egalitarianism and cultural purification alarmed the administrators who kept the state functioning. He recounts how the dying Zhou, at the first National People's Congress since the Cultural Revolution in January 1975, revived the call for the four modernizations in agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology to be achieved before the end of the century, a program that would become Deng's inheritance. He describes how Mao replaced the militant horizontal line with the more flexible three worlds theory, proclaimed by Deng at the United Nations, which placed China at the head of the developing world. And he records the chill of his last visits. The November 1974 Ford-Brezhnev summit at Vladivostok, a city taken from China by an unequal treaty, irritated Beijing. The radical Zhang Chongqiao told an American senator that Taiwan was a noose around the neck of the United States, that the People's Liberation Army would one day cut with its bayonets. Yet the dying Mao insisted the relationship still mattered, for as he put it, the small issue was Taiwan and the big issue was the world. Chapter 12. The Indestructible Deng. The 12th chapter turns to Deng Xiaoping, who transformed Mao's ruined China by basing modernization, in Kissinger's words, on the initiative and resilience of the individual Chinese. Deng abandoned continuous revolution for the pragmatic program he called socialism with Chinese characteristics, and reform and opening up. Kissinger sketches Deng's remarkable survival. Purged during the Cultural Revolution and sent to work in a tractor repair plant, watching his son crippled by Red Guards, he was twice cast down and twice recalled. Mao's best and perhaps only strategic reserve. His manner was the opposite of Mao's, compact, direct, without parables or philosophical pretension, describing himself as a rustic person who had never even learned French during his student years abroad. Where Mao governed as a traditional emperor, the link between heaven and earth, Deng ruled as the principal mandarin, legitimized by performance, holding no major office, almost never appearing on television. His early reform speeches were deliberately pedestrian, about loading more railway cars and barring conductors from drinking on duty. Yet after a decade of anarchy, his call for order, professionalism, and efficiency was, Kissinger writes, a daring proposition. The chapter tracks Deng's ideological maneuvers, elevating the maxim "seek truth from facts" into the essence of Mao Zedong thought, and applying to Mao the same 70% correct, 30% wrong verdict Mao had rendered on Stalin. He confronted the enormous backwardness of China, where trade with the United States at Mao's death had been smaller than American trade with Honduras, and insisted that poverty is not socialism. That China needed foreign technology, expertise, and capital, and had nothing to fear from Western education. Yet Kissinger emphasizes the limit Deng set. His vision did not include a move toward pluralistic democracy, which he believed would bring anarchy, and he spoke instead of a distinctively socialist democracy. Deng abandoned the personality cult, planned an orderly succession, and declined most titles, remarking that his only purpose in giving them up was that he might live longer. He had, Kissinger concludes, tamed and reinvented Mao's legacy, and in so doing performed the ultimate task of a leader, taking his society from where it was to where it had never been, though the tensions he set in motion would culminate in the crisis of Tiananmen Square. Kissinger describes the interregnum after Mao's death, when the colorless Hua Guofeng, elevated by Mao's own blessing, "With you in charge, I am at ease," briefly held every senior post and proclaimed the doctrine of the two whatevers, that the party would uphold whatever Mao had decided and follow whatever Mao had instructed. Hua's one decisive act was to arrest the Gang of Four within a month of Mao's death, but he lacked a political base, and Deng outmaneuvered him not by purging him, but by letting him fade. Deng's method, Kissinger writes, was to cross the river by feeling the stones, advancing pragmatically and testing each step. The turning point was the third plenum of December 1978, which proclaimed reform and opening up, restored private initiative in agriculture, and rehabilitated the victims of earlier campaigns. Deng's watchwords were to emancipate the mind and seek truth from facts, and he warned that when everything must be done by the book, when thinking turns rigid and blind, faith is the fashion, a party or a nation will perish. Kissinger identifies the reformers' peculiar dilemma, the mirror image of the revolutionaries, where revolution concentrates power, reform disperses it, and the freedom of choice it unleashes cannot easily be confined to economics. Deng answered that dilemma by insisting on one-party rule and a distinctly socialist democracy, promoting his lieutenants Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, while withholding the political pluralism he believed would bring only chaos. Chapter 13. Touching the Tiger's Buttocks, the Third Vietnam War. The 13th chapter analyzes China's brief invasion of Vietnam in 1979, undertaken, in Deng's phrase, to teach Vietnam a lesson after its occupation of Cambodia. Kissinger's argument is counterintuitive. Although the war looked like a costly tactical failure, it was in fact a strategic triumph and, he writes, a turning point of the Cold War and the high point of Sino-American strategic cooperation during that conflict. He sets the scene with Vietnam, the confounder of great powers. America had wrongly seen Hanoi as the vanguard of a Sino-Soviet conspiracy. China wrongly saw the American buildup as encirclement. But Hanoi, Kissinger insists, fought only for its own national account, and a unified communist Vietnam would prove a far greater strategic threat to China than to the United States. After Saigon fell in 1975, geopolitics overwhelmed ideology. Vietnam expelled its ethnic Chinese, joined the Soviet economic bloc, signed a friendship treaty with Moscow, and invaded Cambodia to oust the Khmer Rouge. To China, encircled by Soviet divisions to the north, and now by a Soviet ally to the south, this was intolerable. The chapter draws its central contrast between strategic cultures. Where Westerners meet vulnerability with caution, the Chinese response, Kissinger writes, is more likely to magnify defiance, believing in deterrence in the form of preemption. Deng prepared the ground with a diplomacy of shadow play, modeled on Mao's handling of the offshore islands. He completed the normalization of relations with the United States, timing the announcement to coincide with his state visit, and used that visit, complete with a 10-gallon hat at a Texas rodeo, to create the impression of American blessing that would deter the Soviets. Wherever the Soviet Union sticks its fingers, he said, there we must chop them off. And he branded Vietnam the Cuba of the East. He notified President Carter of the coming attack. Carter offered mild disapproval and quiet intelligence support, since, as Brzezinski put it, the United States could not collude formally, but informal collusion was another matter. The invasion, launched in February 1979, lasted 29 days. China captured several provincial capitals and then withdrew. The crucial fact, Kissinger argues, was that the Soviet Union, despite its fresh treaty with Hanoi, did nothing, exposing the limits of Soviet strategic reach. He gives the last word to Lee Kuan Yew. The Western press wrote off the punitive action as a failure, but I believe it changed the history of East Asia. Kissinger enriches the picture with the long history of Vietnamese resistance to Chinese domination, 1,000 years of rule followed by a fierce independence, and recalls that during the peace negotiations, Le Duc Tho had pointedly taken him to Hanoi's Museum of the nation's historic struggles against China. He explains the terms on which normalization with the United States was finally sealed under President Carter, the withdrawal of American forces from Taiwan, the end of the Defense Treaty, and recognition of Beijing as the sole government of China, balanced by the Taiwan Relations Act, through which Congress preserved unofficial ties and arms sales, a studied ambiguity that Kissinger calls the lifeblood of diplomacy. He does not disguise the war's military cost. The People's Liberation Army, not yet recovered from the Cultural Revolution, suffered heavily against battle-hardened Vietnamese defenders, and Deng himself later mused that had China driven deeper, it might have done better still. But the strategic accounting, Kissinger insists, favored China. The Soviet Union was left to subsidize a bleeding Vietnam at a cost of millions of dollars a day, its reach shown to be limited, and the momentum of its advance across the developing world reversed. This, he argues, is why the campaign deserves to be read not as a blunder, but as a deliberate application of Sun Tzu's teaching on shaping the strategic landscape. Kissinger recounts Deng's American journey as a study in this kind of psychological stagecraft. Touring from Washington to Atlanta, Houston, and Seattle, Deng visited automobile plants and aerospace factories, sat in the cockpit of a space shuttle simulator, and donned the 10-gallon hat at a Texas rodeo, cultivating an image of a China at home in the modern world and confident of American goodwill. He explained the four modernizations to his hosts and proposed that the two countries act, in effect, as allies without an alliance, telling President Carter that China wished to postpone a general war for 2 decades in order to complete its development. When he informed Carter of the coming attack on Vietnam, the president responded with a handwritten appeal for restraint and with quiet intelligence cooperation. The collusion, as Brzezinski observed, could not be formal, but informal collusion was another matter entirely. Chapter 14. Reagan and the Advent of Normalcy. The 14th chapter argues that the Reagan years, despite the president's deep personal attachment to Taiwan and a China policy full of apparent contradictions, produced a normal great power relationship without major crisis. As the Soviet threat receded, the two countries drifted from existential partnership toward being, in Kissinger's phrase, partners of convenience. He first notes the structural instability of American foreign policy, in which each change of administration replaces thousands of officials and tempts the newcomers to blame their predecessors, a perpetual psychodrama especially unsettling to a Chinese leadership that depended on parallel assessments. Reagan was an enigma, more vocally anti-communist than any president since John Foster Dulles, yet focused on the Soviet Union rather than China, and warmly attached to Taiwan. The tension came to a head over arms sales to Taiwan, and was managed through the third communique of August 1982, in which the United States said it did not seek to carry out a long-term policy of such sales, and intended to reduce them gradually, language Kissinger calls quite ambiguous, since the key words were never defined. Reagan simultaneously offered Taiwan a set of private assurances, and told interviewers he had not changed his mind one bit. The whole arrangement was, in Kissinger's words, a study in almost incomprehensible contradictions, and yet it worked out quite well, because Reagan never turned disagreements into personal confrontations, and China's leaders understood he had gone as far as his convictions permitted. The real drama, he argues, was with Moscow. By the mid-1980s, the horizontal line Mao had envisioned had effectively formed. The Soviet Union faced coordinated resistance on nearly all its borders, bore a defense burden 3 times heavier than America's as a share of output, and confronted an unmeetable challenge in the Strategic Defense Initiative. From Soviet weakness, the two powers drew opposite lessons. Reagan saw an opening to press for victory, while China recalibrated toward greater freedom of maneuver, returning to Mao's Three Worlds framework, and refusing, in Hu Yaobang's words, to attach itself to any big power or yield to pressure. Meanwhile, Deng's reforms transformed China internally. Kissinger recites the desperate starting point, a workforce that was largely illiterate or semi-illiterate and barely educated, and the mechanics of reform, special economic zones, foreign investment, family farming, membership in the World Bank. Peasant incomes doubled, the private sector grew, and output expanded by more than 9% a year through the decade, even as price reform bred inflation, corruption, and the tensions that a popular television series, River Elegy, would soon dramatize as the old debate over China's destiny. Kissinger notes that Reagan had been sent by Nixon to Taiwan as governor of California in 1971, and had returned with warm feelings that never left him, and that his 1980 campaign pledges, no more Taiwans, no more betrayals, deeply alarmed Beijing. The management of this was left in part to Secretary of State Haig, who wished to arm China as a near ally, and later to George Shultz, a trained economist who cautioned against overstating China's indispensability and favored strict reciprocity and a revived alliance with Japan. Kissinger describes the private 6 assurances given to Taiwan alongside the public communique, so that the arrangement satisfied every party's core interest, while appearing to contradict itself at every turn. On the wider board, Afghanistan had become the Soviet Union's own Vietnam, its resistance backed by the United States, China, the Gulf states, and Pakistan, and by the decade's end, the Soviet retreats had multiplied. Reagan's 1984 visit to China, quoting the Qing and speaking of cooperation, sealed what Kissinger calls the advent of normalcy, a system of Asian states operating, he notes, on essentially Westphalian lines, the pattern of sovereign equality that Europe had adopted in 1648, and that China had once so thoroughly rejected. River Elegy, using the silt-laden Yellow River as an emblem of a stagnant inland civilization, and calling China toward the blue ocean of the wider world, was banned as counter-revolutionary, but it had reopened the generations-long argument that Tiananmen would bring to a head. Chapter 15. Tiananmen. The 15th chapter confronts the crackdown of June 1989, in which, Kissinger writes, America's foundational commitment to human rights collided with China's overriding fear of chaos, and its insistence that domestic order is a precondition of world stability. He argues, controversially, that both sides were in a sense right within their own frameworks, and that President George H.W. Bush's choice of engagement over confrontation preserved a vital relationship. The crisis was triggered by the death in April 1989 of the deposed reformer Hu Xiaoping, which, like Zhou's death in 1976, prompted politically charged mourning. But now, Kissinger notes, the mourners named their targets. Students occupied Tiananmen Square. Protests spread to more than 300 cities. The welcome for the visiting Soviet leader Gorbachev had to be moved humiliatingly to the airport. Deng saw in the occupation an echo of the Cultural Revolution and the historic Chinese terror of Luan, of chaos. Kissinger quotes the scholar Andrew Nathan on the tragic quality of the confrontation, in which each side pushed the other into positions where compromise became impossible. After weeks of division within the leadership, the army cleared the square on June the 4th, before the eyes of the world's television cameras that had come for the summit. The chapter then becomes a meditation on the perennial argument between idealists and realists in American foreign policy. Kissinger insists the debate is rarely absolute. The real questions were what price America was prepared to pay and what capacity it had to bring about the outcome it desired. He recounts Bush's tightrope. The president imposed sanctions and suspended exchanges, yet wrote privately to Deng as a friend, invoking American reverence for Chinese history, and dispatched Scowcroft and Eagleburger on a secret mission to Beijing to keep the relationship alive. Deng told them China did not care about the sanctions and would not be moved by pressure, recalling a 22-year war that had cost more than 20 million lives, and adding that it was up to the one who tied the knot to untie it. Kissinger reflects that democratic institutions do not guarantee compatible interests, that Western human rights concepts may not translate immediately into a civilization ordered for millennia around different concepts, and yet that America should never abandon its commitment to human dignity. He closes on Deng's parting counsel to his colleagues, his famous 24-character instruction, to observe calmly, secure China's position, hide its capacities and bide its time, be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership, and asks whether this was advice for a moment of weakness or a permanent maxim for the day of China's resurgence. Kissinger uses the episode to state a principle he returns to throughout the book, the recurring American debate between idealists, who would make the promotion of human rights and democracy the organizing purpose of foreign policy, and realists, who begin from interests and the balance of power, is, he argues, rarely as absolute as its partisans suppose. Most real decisions turn on nuance, on judgments of price and capacity, rather than of principle alone. He grants that some abuses are so egregious that no relationship is possible, but insists that a country as vital to American security as China, and as scarred by the memory of foreign intervention, could not be coerced into transformation from outside. The wiser course, in his view, was neither to abandon American values, nor to make them the instrument of confrontation, but to let them find their place within the whole range of a relationship that neither side could afford to sever. Kissinger fills in the diplomacy that followed the crackdown. Bush and his national security advisor, Scowcroft, both veterans of the Nixon-era opening who had known Deng personally, believed that isolating China would fail against a society that had not buckled even when the Soviet Union withdrew its aid in 1959. Bush wrote privately to Deng as a friend, expressing reverence for Chinese history while insisting that America's reaction sprang from its founding principles and not from arrogance, and he dispatched Scowcroft and Eagleburger on a secret mission within weeks of the violence, their unmarked aircraft nearly fired upon by Chinese air defenses that had not been told of its coming. A second, semi-public mission that December produced a televised toast that made Scowcroft, in Kissinger's phrase, an instant celebrity in the most negative sense. The affair was entangled with the case of the dissident physicist Fang Lejie, who had taken refuge in the American embassy, and whose eventual departure was negotiated as part of a package. All of this unfolded as the Berlin Wall fell and the premises of Cold War policy dissolved. Deng, retiring from his last formal post, warned his colleagues that the enemy's whole attention would now be concentrated on China, and that what the country required above all was stability, and still more stability. Chapter 16. What Kind of Reform? Dengs Southern Tour. The 16th chapter describes the aged Deng's final political act, his 1992 Southern Tour, undertaken to rescue and accelerate economic reform after Tiananmen threatened to reverse it. Kissinger argues that the greater danger to reform came not from foreign sanctions, but from the domestic conservative backlash, which blamed Deng's evolutionary policy and warned that opening up would ruin the socialist cause. Deng's answer was to redefine good governance as material well-being and productivity rather than ideological purity. In early 1992, at the age of 87 and holding no official title, he traveled south to the special economic zones of Shenzhen and Zhuhai, moving, Kissinger writes, like an itinerant preacher through schools and factories. The conservative-controlled national press ignored him at first, and his words filtered back to the mainland through the Hong Kong press before taking on almost mythical significance. His slogan, still quoted on billboards, was that development is the absolute principle. He insisted reform was itself revolutionary, that liberalization must continue for 100 years, and that the profit motive was not a rival theory to Marxism but an observation of human nature. His call to boldness was memorable. "We must not act like women with bound feet," he said. "Once we are sure that something should be done, we should dare to experiment and break a new path." Kissinger notes the nationalist logic beneath the economics. Deng had watched the small dragon economies of East Asia grow at 8 to 10% a year, and concluded that China must grow faster still to resume its rightful place. He extolled modest consumer benchmarks, a bicycle, a sewing machine, a radio, and a wristwatch, as measures of how far the country would come, and set the goal of making China a moderately developed country within 100 years of the founding of the People's Republic, a target Kissinger observes China would meet a full generation early. The Southern Tour was Deng's last public service. Implementation passed to Jiang Zemin and the premier Zhu Rongji, and Deng retired into inaccessibility, dying in 1997. By the end of Jiang's term, the debate had shifted from whether reform was correct to the far larger question of what a dynamic, rising China would mean for the order of the world. Kissinger underscores that the conservative reaction, not the sanctions, was the true peril. The party elder Deng Lekun warned that unless liberalization and capitalistic reform were resisted, the socialist cause would be ruined, and some conservatives sought to reverse even the condemnation of the Cultural Revolution. Against them, Deng argued that improved living standards and rising productivity were the best guarantee of social stability, and that reform must therefore go faster, not slower. He defended foreign investment on plain grounds, that foreign-funded enterprises paid taxes, employed workers, and transferred technology and managerial skill, and he warned, remarkably for one who had once built the communes, that the deepest-rooted danger now came from the left, which could destroy fine things overnight. He insisted that intellectuals were part of the working class, and urged even the exiled supporters of the Tiananmen protest to come home and contribute. Yet Kissinger also detects in Deng's final speeches the melancholy of old age, a leader who confessed that he had insisted on retiring lest he make mistakes in his dotage, since old people, as he said, have strengths but also the great weakness of stubbornness, and who wished above all for the stability that would let him sleep soundly. Chapter 17. A roller coaster ride toward another reconciliation, the Jiang Zemin era. The 17th chapter traces the turbulent decade after Tiananmen, when, Kissinger writes, Sino-American relations reverted almost to their starting point before 1971, now complicated by a post-Cold War American conviction of the universal relevance of its values, which collided with Chinese claims of sovereignty. Through this turbulence, the underrated Jiang Zemin steered China out of isolation and into a stunning economic ascent. Kissinger stresses how thoroughly Jiang was underestimated. Elevated from Shanghai after handling the local protests without bloodshed, he was the first communist leader without revolutionary or military credentials, and his affable, informal manner, singing songs, reciting the Gettysburg Address, quoting phrases in several languages, led many outsiders to mistake bonhomie for a lack of seriousness. The opposite, Kissinger writes, was true. With Foreign Minister Ken Keachin and the economic reformer Zhu Rongji, Jiang defended China's institutions while deepening its links to the world economy. His stance recalled traditional diplomacy. Reform would be voluntary, for, as he said, Chinese history proves that greater pressure only leads to greater resistance. The chapter's analytical thread is the debate between transactional and values-based diplomacy. Kissinger recounts the battle over most favored nation trading status, which the Clinton administration first conditioned on human rights progress and then, in May 1994, abandoned as unworkable, a sequence he says should be studied carefully by advocates of a confrontational policy in his own day. He describes the collapse of the Soviet Union as an object lesson the Chinese studied closely, concluding that Gorbachev had erred in giving political opening priority over economic reform. Zhu Rongji, hailed abroad as China's Gorbachev, retorted, "I'm not China's Gorbachev. I'm China's Zhu Rongji." The decade brought sharp crises. The Third Taiwan Strait confrontation of 1995 and 1996, set off by a visit by Taiwan's President Lee Teng-hui to Cornell, in which China fired missiles into the strait and the United States sent 2 carrier battle groups, and the accidental American bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, which Deng called deliberate provocation. Yet across the same years, China's economy never grew less than 7%. It weathered the Asian financial crisis, and by 2001 it had won the 2008 Olympics and joined the World Trade Organization. Yang's valedictory reflections, delivered as an American reconnaissance plane collision was being diffused, spoke unusually of compromise and invoked his descent, calculated as an engineer 78 generations from Confucius. Kissinger dwells further on the Soviet collapse as the event that most shaped Chinese thinking in these years. He draws a sharp contrast. The disputes within the Chinese party concerned how the party should govern, whereas the Soviet disputes came to concern whether it should govern at all. He records the disastrous visit of Secretary of State Christopher in March 1994, timed to the opening of China's National People's Congress, which Christopher's own aide, a veteran of negotiations with the North Vietnamese, called the most brutal diplomatic meeting he had ever attended. On Taiwan, Kissinger recounts how the island's turn to democracy and its president's private visit to Cornell provoked the confrontation of 1995 and 1996, in which the United States responded with the largest naval deployment since the opening of relations, and how Jiang told him that of Mao's 100-year patience over Taiwan, only 77 years now remained. The bombing of the embassy in Belgrade brought Jiang's furious insistence that the great People's Republic would never again be bullied, humiliated, or conquered. Yet across the same turbulent decade, China's economy grew without pause, weathered the Asian financial crisis behind its capital controls, and by 2001 had won the Olympic Games and entered the World Trade Organization, while Jiang's doctrine of the three represents opened the party itself to the entrepreneurs the revolution had once condemned. Kissinger emphasizes the scale of the transformation these years wrought. Over the decade, Chinese trade with the United States multiplied several times over. Chinese exports to America rose many-fold, and China became one of the largest foreign holders of American government debt, binding the two economies together even as their political values diverged. He credits the premier Zhu Rongji, whom he calls a reformer of exceptional force, with restructuring the state enterprises and steering the accession to the World Trade Organization, and Jiang himself with the political skill to hold a collective leadership together while opening the country ever wider. The relationship that emerged, he observes, still lacked the defining shared purpose that opposition to Soviet hegemony had once supplied, and the two governments would spend the coming years searching, not always successfully, for a new organizing principle to take its place. Chapter 18. The New Millennium. The 18th chapter carries the story into the new century, when, Kissinger writes, the United States and China entered a phase of cooperative coexistence without a shared adversary or a joint concept of world order. Under the fourth generation of leaders, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, a now confident China revived its Confucian tradition and pursued what it called peaceful rise or peaceful development. These were the first leaders without revolutionary experience, and the first to take office through settled constitutional processes. Both had been sent as young men to the poor interior province of Gansu. There China no longer felt itself an apprentice to the West. It pursued a moderately well-off society, established Confucius institutes abroad, and in January 2011 placed the statue of Confucius in Tiananmen Square. Kissinger surveys the emerging divergences, the daily dispute over the value of China's currency, which he insists is at bottom political rather than economic, since Premier Wen argued that a sudden revaluation would bankrupt Chinese firms and cause major disturbances, and the problem of nuclear proliferation, above all North Korea, where the same two powers that had first fought in Korea in 1950 now had a shared interest in preventing a nuclear cascade across Asia. The heart of the chapter is what Kissinger calls China's national destiny debate, now conducted from a position of strength rather than peril. The financial crisis of 2008, which originated in the West, together with the stalemate of America's Middle Eastern wars and the triumphant Beijing Olympics, seriously undermine the mystique of Western economic prowess. He describes China's remarkable habit of public self-reflection, the lectures and television series on the rise and fall of great powers watched by hundreds of millions, and the doctrine of peaceful rise advanced by Zheng Bijian, who argued China would transcend the traditional path by which great powers had emerged through conflict. Against this stood a rising triumphalist current, expressed in bestsellers such as China is Unhappy and China Dream, the latter by a colonel of the National Defense University, who argued that China should aim frankly to become the leading power in the world and match its economic rise with a military one. Kissinger balances these against the sober reaffirmation by State Councilor Dai Bingguo that China would keep to peaceful development, that this was neither a ruse nor a delusion, that with 150 million people below the poverty line, China was in no position to be arrogant, and that if China ever sought hegemony, the world should oppose and even fight it. He doubts, however, that this will be the last word, and anticipates a fifth generation, coming to power in 2012, the first since the early 19th century, to be raised in a China at peace and unified. Epilogue. Does history repeat itself? The Crow Memorandum. The epilogue steps back to ask whether the United States and China are fated to repeat the tragedy of Britain and Germany before the First World War. Kissinger's answer is that this outcome is a warning, not a destiny. He recalls that in 1907, a British Foreign Office official, Eyre Crow, wrote a famous memorandum arguing that it made no difference what goals Germany avowed, since a rising power's capabilities alone, regardless of its intentions, would eventually compel resistance. Formal assurances were meaningless, Crow reasoned, because ambitious designs are not, as a rule, openly proclaimed. Britain, therefore, had to assume the worst. It took 7 years for that logic of automaticity to produce a world war over disputes that were, in themselves, relatively trivial, but that had turned into symbols with a momentum of their own. Kissinger reconstructs the mechanism of that catastrophe. For most of the 19th century, Europe had enjoyed a rough equilibrium among its great powers, with shifting alliances and no general war since 1815. The unification of Germany in 1871 was a structural change, consolidating the 39 states of the old German Confederation, which had functioned almost like an early United Nations, into a single power strong enough to defeat any neighbor singly, but vulnerable if they combined. German diplomacy then produced the very encirclement it feared, humiliating France and Russia in successive crises, and building a navy that Britain could only read as a threat to its existence, until, as Kissinger writes, foreign policy had become a zero-sum game. Applied to the present, a Crow-style analysis would treat any Chinese rise as incompatible with America's position in the Pacific, and counsel America to act now as if the confrontation had already begun, and he notes an exact mirror image in Chinese nationalist writing that treats conflict with America as an inherent, zero-sum duel of the century. Kissinger argues, however, that the analogy is inexact and the outcome avoidable. A Cold War between the two would arrest global progress for a generation. China's rise is not guaranteed, for no issue preoccupies its leaders more than national unity and social cohesion amid vast internal disparities, 150 million people in poverty, and a population that will age dramatically, its working age share cresting around 2015, and the presence of nuclear weapons means that, unlike the leaders of 1914, contemporary leaders can have no illusions about the cost of war. His prescription is what he calls coevolution rather than partnership, each country pursuing its domestic imperatives, cooperating where possible, and minimizing conflict, while working toward a Pacific community that would include the United States, China, and the other major nations of the region, easing the mutual fear of containment or exclusion. The crucial competition, he insists, is more likely to be economic and social than military, and building American competitiveness is a largely American task that China should not be asked to solve. He ends by recalling Zhou Enlai's remark, on the eve of announcing the secret opening, that the news would shake the world, and by posing his own culminating hope. What a culmination it would be if 40 years later, the United States and China could merge their efforts not to shake the world, but to build it.